During my decades working in prisons and public hospitals, I've witnessed something far more disturbing than individual criminality or mental illness. I've observed the systematic erosion of the capacity for independent thought, a phenomenon so gradual, so seemingly benign, that most people remain entirely unaware they're participating in their own intellectual enslavement. We stand at a historical precipice. The generation currently coming of age may well be the last to possess even a vestigial understanding of what genuine freedom means. Not freedom as a political slogan or constitutional principle, but freedom as a lived reality, the capacity to think critically, to question authority, to resist popular delusions, and to maintain moral standards despite social pressure to abandon them. What I've seen in my clinical practice reveals a terrifying truth: the human capacity for independent judgment is not automatic. It requires cultivation, protection, and constant vigilance. When these conditions disappear, as they have in much of Western society, freedom itself becomes not just endangered but literally incomprehensible to those who have never experienced it. The Progressive Project, for all its ostensible concern with liberation, has produced the most comprehensive system of thought control in human history. Unlike the crude totalitarianism of the 20th century, this new form of tyranny operates through manufactured consent, emotional manipulation, and the systematic destruction of the intellectual tools necessary for resistance. This may be our final opportunity to understand what we're losing before it disappears forever. Chapter 1: The Clinical Evidence of Intellectual Surrender. The most shocking discovery of my medical career wasn't any particular disease or pathology. It was the realization that vast numbers of people have voluntarily surrendered their capacity for independent thought. In my consulting room, I've encountered countless individuals who literally cannot formulate an opinion that deviates from what they've been told to think. Consider a typical case: a young woman, university educated, presenting with anxiety and depression. When I inquired about her beliefs regarding personal responsibility for her circumstances, she responded with a perfectly rehearsed litany about systemic oppression, structural inequalities, and the impossibility of individual agency in a racist, sexist society. When pressed to explain how these abstract concepts related to her specific situation, her decision to accumulate massive debt for a worthless degree, her choice of unsuitable romantic partners, her refusal to seek employment beneath her imagined status, she became genuinely confused and agitated. It wasn't that she disagreed with alternative explanations, she literally couldn't comprehend them. The intellectual framework for personal responsibility had been so thoroughly eradicated from her mind that suggestions of individual agency registered as incomprehensible noise. She had been rendered cognitively incapable of thinking outside the progressive paradigm. This phenomenon extends far beyond my clinic. I've observed it in universities, where students can recite complex theories about social justice but cannot engage in basic logical reasoning about cause and effect. I've seen it in hospitals, where medical professionals abandon clinical judgment in favor of ideologically correct diagnoses. I've witnessed it in prisons, where criminals have been so thoroughly convinced of their victimhood that they've lost all capacity for genuine remorse or moral reflection. The pattern is always the same: the substitution of ideological programming for independent thought. These individuals haven't chosen their beliefs through careful consideration, they've absorbed them through constant repetition and emotional conditioning. They cannot defend their positions through rational argument because they've never actually examined them. They simply know what they're supposed to think and feel genuine distress when confronted with alternatives. Most disturbingly, this intellectual surrender is often accompanied by a profound sense of moral superiority. Having been taught that their programmed responses represent the height of enlightened thinking, they view any deviation as evidence of moral deficiency. They've become simultaneously enslaved and self-righteous, a combination that makes genuine dialogue virtually impossible. This is not merely ignorance or poor education. It represents a fundamental alteration in the structure of human consciousness, the creation of minds incapable of independent moral reasoning. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Mental Imprisonment. The destruction of independent thought requires sophisticated psychological techniques that go far beyond simple propaganda. What I've observed is a comprehensive system designed to make freedom of thought literally unthinkable, not just discouraged, but psychologically impossible. The first element is the cultivation of emotional dependency. From early childhood, people are taught that their feelings are the ultimate arbiter of truth. If something makes them feel bad, it must be wrong. If it makes them feel good, it must be right. This eliminates the need for rational analysis, evidence, or logical consistency. Complex moral and political questions are reduced to emotional reactions, making serious intellectual discourse impossible. I've seen patients who become genuinely distressed when asked to consider evidence that contradicts their preferred beliefs. They experience physical symptoms, anxiety, nausea, even panic attacks, when confronted with inconvenient facts. This isn't mere stubbornness, it's a conditioned response that makes critical thinking literally painful. The second technique is the manipulation of language to prevent clear thinking. Every totalitarian system understands that controlling language means controlling thought. What's unprecedented is the voluntary adoption of this linguistic manipulation by supposedly free societies. We now have entire vocabularies designed to obscure rather than illuminate reality. Consider how certain words have been rendered unspeakable, not through legal prohibition, but through social conditioning so complete that people censor themselves automatically. Try discussing immigration policy without using the approved euphemisms, or examining crime statistics without the proper qualifications and disclaimers. The language itself has been corrupted to make honest analysis impossible. The third element is the creation of substitute authorities. Having destroyed traditional sources of moral guidance, family, religion, local community, the system provides replacement authorities that offer the comfort of certainty without the burden of personal responsibility. These new authorities, media experts, academic specialists, celebrity activists, tell people what to think and feel about every conceivable issue. Most people embrace this arrangement because independent thought is genuinely difficult and often painful. It's much easier to adopt pre-packaged opinions than to engage in the hard work of moral reasoning. The system provides intellectual comfort food, ideas that feel good and require no effort to digest. The final technique is the criminalization of dissent through social ostracism. While physical persecution remains relatively rare, social and professional destruction awaits anyone who challenges progressive orthodoxy. This creates a powerful incentive structure that rewards conformity and punishes independence. The result is a population that believes itself free while living in profound intellectual bondage, minds that have been systematically programmed to reject the very concepts necessary for liberation. Chapter 3: The Corruption of Education as Thought Control. The transformation of education from instruction to indoctrination represents perhaps the most crucial component of the freedom-destroying apparatus. Having spent considerable time observing the products of modern educational systems, I can testify that we're witnessing the deliberate production of intellectual slaves. Consider what passes for education today. Instead of teaching students how to think, we teach them what to think. Instead of developing critical reasoning skills, we instill emotional responses to approved stimuli. Instead of encouraging intellectual independence, we reward conformity to fashionable prejudices. The result is a generation that possesses the vocabulary of education without any of its substance. I regularly encounter university graduates who cannot construct a logical argument, examine evidence objectively, or consider perspectives that challenge their preconceptions. They have been taught to recognize and recite correct opinions, but they lack the intellectual tools necessary for independent analysis. When confronted with complex problems, They resort to ideological formulas rather than genuine reasoning. The corruption begins early and operates through several mechanisms. First, the substitution of feelings for facts. Students are taught that their emotional responses to information are more important than its accuracy or relevance. If historical facts make certain groups feel bad, those facts are minimized or eliminated from curricula. If scientific data contradicts preferred narratives, it's dismissed as biased or oppressive. Second, the replacement of moral reasoning with moral posturing. Instead of learning to navigate ethical dilemmas through careful analysis of competing principles, students are taught to identify and denounce moral violations as defined by current orthodoxy. They learn to signal virtue rather than practice it, to recognize heresy rather than pursue truth. Third, the elimination of intellectual humility through the cultivation of moral arrogance. Students are taught that they live in the most enlightened age in human history and that previous generations were ignorant and prejudiced. This prevents them from learning from accumulated human wisdom and makes them susceptible to every fashionable delusion. The most insidious aspect of this educational corruption is that it produces people who believe themselves to be supremely educated while remaining fundamentally ignorant. They possess credentials but lack knowledge, degrees but not understanding. They can recite complex theories about social justice but cannot balance a checkbook or maintain a stable relationship. These educationally damaged individuals then become teachers, professors, journalists, and policymakers, perpetuating and amplifying the very intellectual corruption that created them. Each generation becomes more thoroughly indoctrinated than the last, more completely severed from the intellectual traditions that make freedom possible. What we're witnessing isn't the reform of education but its deliberate destruction. The goal isn't to create independent thinkers but compliant consumers of approved ideas. And judging by the intellectual caliber of recent graduates, this project is succeeding beyond its architect's wildest dreams. Chapter 4: The Psychology of Voluntary Servitude. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our current predicament is how eagerly people embrace their own intellectual enslavement. In my clinical practice, I've observed that the surrender of independent thought often brings genuine psychological relief, a phenomenon that explains why totalitarian movements so often begin with popular enthusiasm rather than violent coercion. The burden of independent moral reasoning is considerable. It requires constant vigilance, intellectual humility, and the courage to reach unpopular conclusions. Most people find this exhausting and prefer to delegate such responsibilities to external authorities. What they don't realize is that once this delegation becomes habitual, the capacity for independent thought atrophies like an unused muscle. I've treated numerous patients who experienced severe anxiety when forced to make decisions without clear guidance from approved sources. One young man became genuinely distressed when I suggested he evaluate his life choices based on personal experience rather than expert opinion. The idea of trusting his own judgment seemed not just wrong but dangerous, a violation of everything he'd been taught about the superior wisdom of credentialed authorities. This psychological dependency is carefully cultivated through several mechanisms. First, the constant emphasis on complexity and expertise. People are taught that modern problems are too complicated for ordinary understanding and require specialized knowledge available only to certified experts. This creates learned helplessness, the belief that independent judgment is not just inadequate but presumptuous. Second, the cultivation of fear about the consequences of wrong thinking. People are constantly warned about the dangers of bias, prejudice, and ignorance, but only certain types of bias are recognized as problematic. The result is a paralyzing anxiety about moral judgment that can only be relieved by accepting approved opinions from designated authorities. Third, the provision of moral certainty in exchange for intellectual submission. Progressive ideology offers simple answers to complex questions and clear moral categories for every situation. This psychological comfort is so appealing that people willingly surrender their critical faculties to obtain it. The most tragic cases are those who have retained some capacity for independent thought but live in constant fear of exercising it. They recognize the contradictions and absurdities in progressive orthodoxy but lack the courage to trust their own perceptions. They suffer from a form of intellectual Stockholm syndrome, simultaneously recognizing and defending the system that oppresses them. These individuals often seek therapy not because they want to develop independent judgment, but because they want to eliminate the psychological discomfort that comes from thinking unapproved thoughts. They want to become more perfectly programmed, not more genuinely free. This voluntary aspect of intellectual enslavement makes it far more dangerous than traditional tyranny. When people choose their chains, they become emotionally invested in maintaining them. They resist liberation not because they fear their oppressors, but because they've learned to fear themselves. The result is a population of willing slaves who experience their bondage as enlightenment and their programming as sophisticated thinking. Chapter 5. The language of liberation becomes the tool of oppression. One of the most brilliant aspects of contemporary thought control is how it has appropriated the vocabulary of freedom to advance the cause of intellectual slavery. Words like liberation, empowerment, and social justice now serve purposes diametrically opposed to their original meanings, a linguistic corruption that makes resistance difficult and recognition of the problem nearly impossible. I first became aware of this phenomenon while working with patients who had been thoroughly indoctrinated by therapeutic culture. They spoke constantly about healing, growth, and self-discovery, but their actual behavior suggested increasing dependence, diminished personal responsibility, and a profound disconnection from reality. The language of liberation had become a means of perpetual infantilization. This linguistic corruption operates through several mechanisms. First, the redefinition of freedom as the absence of constraints rather than the capacity for self-governance. True freedom requires the ability to control one's impulses, delay gratification, and make rational choices despite emotional pressure. But the new definition equates freedom with the immediate satisfaction of desires, regardless of consequences. Under this perverted understanding, anyone who suggests that certain behaviors might be self-destructive is condemned as oppressive. Parents who set boundaries for their children, teachers who maintain academic standards, employers who expect professional behavior, all are reimagined as agents of tyranny. The result is a society that systematically undermines the very conditions necessary for genuine human flourishing. Second, the transformation of equality from a legal principle into a psychological demand. Classical liberalism sought equal treatment under the law and equal opportunity for advancement. But the new equality requires equal outcomes and equal self-esteem regardless of effort, behavior, or achievement. This impossible standard creates perpetual grievance and demands ever-increasing levels of social engineering to maintain the illusion of fairness. Third, the redefinition of tolerance from a civic virtue into a moral absolute. Traditional tolerance meant allowing others to live according to their values while maintaining one's own moral standards. But contemporary tolerance demands the suspension of all moral judgment and the acceptance of every lifestyle choice as equally valid. This creates a moral vacuum that can only be filled by external authorities who determine which forms of intolerance are permissible. Perhaps most insidiously, the corruption of education language has made it virtually impossible to discuss the intellectual damage being done to young people. When teachers abandon rigorous standards, they claim to be meeting students where they are. When curricula are purged of challenging content, this is called culturally responsive pedagogy. When students are shielded from uncomfortable truths, this becomes creating safe spaces. Each euphemism makes it harder to recognize the problem, let alone address it. How do you resist inclusion or oppose diversity? How do you argue against equity or social justice? The very language has been weaponized to prevent critical examination of the policies it describes. The result is a totalitarian system that operates through the vocabulary of liberation, a form of intellectual oppression so sophisticated that its victims actively defend and promote their own enslavement while believing themselves to be fighting for freedom. Chapter 6: The Final Generation: Why Recovery May Be Impossible. After decades of observing the progressive degradation of intellectual capacity, I've reached a sobering conclusion: we may have passed the point of no return. The current generation of young adults may be the last to possess even vestigial memories of what independent thought looks like, and their children may be the first to live in complete intellectual darkness. This isn't merely pessimistic speculation, it's based on observable evidence from my clinical practice and broader social interactions. The cognitive tools necessary for independent moral reasoning, logical analysis, historical perspective, intellectual humility, respect for evidence, have been so thoroughly eliminated from educational and cultural institutions that most young people have never encountered them in functional form. Consider the intellectual prerequisites for freedom: the ability to recognize propaganda, the courage to question authority, the discipline to examine one's own beliefs, the wisdom to learn from history, and the moral strength to maintain unpopular positions. Each of these capacities requires development through practice and education. When the institutions responsible for this development are captured by totalitarian ideology, the capacities themselves disappear. I've observed this deterioration accelerating with each passing year. Students who entered university a decade ago, while already severely impaired intellectually, still retain some capacity for logical reasoning. Today's students often lack even this rudimentary ability. They cannot distinguish between evidence and assertion, between correlation and causation, between fact and opinion. They have been so thoroughly conditioned to respond emotionally to approved stimuli that rational discourse has become literally impossible. The situation is compounded by technological developments that reinforce intellectual passivity. Social media algorithms create information bubbles that eliminate exposure to challenging ideas. Search engines manipulate results to support preferred narratives. Digital platforms provide instant emotional gratification while discouraging sustained reflection. The result is a generation with shorter attention spans, less intellectual curiosity, and greater susceptibility to manipulation than any in human history. Perhaps most ominously, the current generation shows little interest in preserving intellectual freedom for the future. Having never experienced genuine independence of thought, they don't understand what they're losing. They actively support censorship, demand protection from challenging ideas, and view intellectual conformity as a moral virtue. They are not just victims of totalitarian conditioning, they have become its enthusiastic agents. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to civilizational survival. Free societies depend on citizens capable of independent moral reasoning, critical evaluation of government policies, and resistance to popular delusions. When these capacities disappear, democracy becomes impossible to maintain. The forms may persist, but the substance inevitably gives way to some form of tyranny. I've seen this pattern in my patients who surrender personal responsibility for their lives to therapeutic authorities, in students who delegate moral reasoning to academic experts, and in citizens who abandon political judgment to media specialists. The mechanism is always the same: the voluntary surrender of human agency in exchange for the comfort of certainty and the relief from responsibility. Unless this trend is reversed immediately, we face the prospect of a society populated entirely by willing slaves, people who have been so thoroughly conditioned that they cannot even conceive of alternatives to their bondage. Chapter 7: The Narrow Path to Intellectual Liberation. Despite the overwhelming evidence of intellectual deterioration, I maintain that recovery remains possible, but only if we understand both the magnitude of the challenge and the precise nature of the remedies required. The path to liberation is narrow and demanding, but it exists for those with the courage to pursue it. The first requirement is the recognition that intellectual freedom is not a natural state but an achievement that must be constantly defended and renewed. Most people assume that the capacity for independent thought is automatic, like breathing or digestion. In reality, it requires deliberate cultivation through rigorous intellectual discipline. Without this understanding, all efforts at liberation will fail. The second requirement is the systematic rejection of emotional reasoning in favor of logical analysis. This doesn't mean suppressing emotions, but rather refusing to allow them to substitute for rational thought. Every belief must be examined for logical consistency, empirical support, and practical consequences. Comfortable illusions must be abandoned regardless of their psychological appeal. In my clinical practice, I've found that this process often produces significant emotional distress. Patients who have relied on victim narratives to explain their circumstances must confront the painful reality of personal responsibility. Students who have been taught that their feelings validate their beliefs must learn to distinguish between preference and truth. The discomfort is inevitable but temporary, the price of intellectual maturity. The third requirement is the cultivation of historical perspective. Most contemporary delusions depend on historical ignorance. People who understand how previous generations lived, what they believed, and what they achieved are far less susceptible to the arrogance and naivety that characterize progressive ideology. This requires reading primary sources, not contemporary interpretations that filter historical reality through current prejudices. The fourth requirement is the development of intellectual courage, the willingness to reach unpopular conclusions and defend them despite social pressure. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of intellectual liberation because it requires sacrificing social approval for intellectual integrity. Most people prefer comfortable conformity to uncomfortable truth, which is why totalitarian systems succeed through peer pressure rather than physical coercion. The fifth requirement is the establishment of communities that support independent thinking. Intellectual liberation cannot be sustained in isolation. We need institutions, families, schools, churches, associations, that reward intellectual courage and punish intellectual cowardice. This means creating parallel structures that operate according to different principles than the corrupted mainstream institutions. The sixth requirement is the transmission of intellectual tools to the next generation. This cannot be accomplished through existing educational institutions, which are thoroughly captured by totalitarian ideology. It requires private tutoring, homeschooling, alternative educational models, and the patient work of intellectual reconstruction at the most basic level. Finally, we must understand that intellectual liberation is ultimately a spiritual discipline. It requires the subordination of immediate desires to long-term truth, the sacrifice of social comfort for moral integrity, and the acceptance of uncertainty in place of false certainty. These are not merely intellectual achievements but character developments that transform the entire personality. The task is daunting, but history provides examples of successful resistance to totalitarian conditioning. Small groups of intellectually liberated individuals have repeatedly succeeded in preserving and transmitting human wisdom through dark periods. We have the opportunity to become such a group, but only if we abandon the illusion that freedom can be preserved without sacrifice and struggle. Conclusion. The choice before us is stark and urgent. We can continue the comfortable slide into intellectual slavery, embracing the illusion of enlightenment while surrendering the substance of human freedom. Or we can undertake the difficult work of intellectual liberation, knowing that the effort may be too late and the odds overwhelming. My decades of clinical observation have convinced me that most people will choose slavery. The comfort of certainty, the relief from responsibility, and the pleasure of moral superiority are too appealing to resist. They will surrender their capacity for independent thought gladly, even enthusiastically, in exchange for the psychological benefits of ideological conformity. But some will choose differently. They will recognize that intellectual freedom is worth any sacrifice and that the alternative, a world populated entirely by willing slaves, is too horrible to contemplate. They will undertake the patient work of intellectual reconstruction, knowing that they may be among the last to remember what genuine freedom means. The outcome remains uncertain. We may succeed in preserving and transmitting the intellectual tools necessary for human flourishing. Or we may fail, leaving future generations to live in darkness so complete that they cannot even imagine the light their ancestors once knew. What is certain is that the time for comfortable delusions has passed. We must choose intellectual courage or moral cowardice, difficult truth or pleasant lies, genuine freedom or sophisticated slavery. The choice we make will determine not just our own fate, but the fate of human civilization itself. The last generation of free people stands at the crossroads. The path we choose will echo through eternity.